There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. So that is our first glitch for the day. That will be the, it's not gonna be the last one. We all know that. We've all been doing this a little bit before. So we're gonna talk about scaffolding and the ability to design scaffolding exercises and aids for everybody. Now I can see everything here a little bit better. So there we go. Open questions. All right. So we're going to talk about a little bit about learning pathways. We're going to talk about the zone of proximal development. Then we're going to get into scaffolding, some approaches to scaffolding. We're going to talk about building those scaffolds and then some strategies behind them. And it's going to be kind of interesting to do this, because usually this is a live workshop that I do, but we're going to do this online. And well, it's kind of silly because it is live. I don't think I'm going to have any robots out there. But I want you to right now think about a topic that you have a difficult time, or that your students have a difficult time grasping. Take a couple of seconds. Throw some things up here, either in the QA or the chat section. What are some topics that we have that are just, yeah, no matter how much we teach it, our students just don't get it, or they have a hard time getting it? Med math. Oh yeah, med math is just, especially it's gonna be interesting with the whole idea with coming back to some of this new math that's out there: acid-base, cranial nerves, cardiac emergencies, endocrine, and really a lot of this. I bet you, I hope you're all looking through these and looking at the ideas. And some of you are going to look at it going, "Oh wow, that cardiac emergencies, that's easy. I have no problem doing that." And some of you may look at it going, wow, cardiac emergencies, I hate teaching cardiac emergencies. I'm a respiratory guy. I like the respiratory side of things. And a lot of the Krebs cycle, and a lot of these things come down to our own comfort, our own knowledge in that. So taking some of these ideas here, let me ask you, what generally happens when students try to learn this topic? What do? So whatever topic you chose, whichever one you chose, what happens when they try to learn it? Go ahead and throw those in the chat real quick. Frustration. Yeah. Click all panelists and attendees. Excellent. Thank you, Scott, for putting it up there. You get angry looks. Yeah, anytime I bring up acid-base balance, people just, heads hit the desks. People climb under desks on sequence information, active engagement. This helps them learn. But what happens to them when they try to learn it? They just don't get it. They start to shut down. They start to feel like they're failing, which kind of takes us to my next question. Identify who the typical students are who are unable to grasp this information. So whatever topic you had, you probably had a picture in your mind of a student or a group of students that you're like, oh, if I gotta go and teach these guys this, it's gonna be a long day. For example, me going the opposite side, shock. I love teaching firefighter shock, especially if they understand pumps, because they get it. But we start to look at the idea of who is this, because I guarantee it. Are they new paramedic students, new EMT students, EMR students? But all these come into play into what we're looking at. Next, and you can throw all these things in the chat. So all these questions, throw them in the chat so everyone kind of sees what you're doing. I want this to be as interactive as possible. But describe when or under what circumstances these failures occur. Is there a specific time? If they're left without facilitation, that's a great one, Connie. And we're going to really get into facilitation. EMTs who feel that they're too old to learn new tricks. Oh, excellent, Neil. That is when we start to see issues. We start to have the idea, especially in terms of continuing education, because medicines we know have changed. Think about the first time you went back to talk about pulling backboards off the ambulances and collars, and looking at some of us who've been doing this for years, and those were a staple where we failed, you know, exams and practicals. That's not the way it's always done. Yeah, so some of it's going to be attitude. Now, I want you to, you're right, they do need to know the why. And that's what we're going to get into. So what I want you to do is in that failure for them to learn, in that failure for them to grasp that, identify where this failure occurs, typically occurs. And this may be a physical, you know, location, or even better, it may be where in the course this information is presented. So take that topic that you had, and where did it occur? Is it that maybe we are presenting information out of order? Is there a better way of presenting information? Because these are some of the things that we're going to look at. Finally, what I want you to do, I want you to hypothesize as to why the students are unable to grasp the information. Why can't they get this? I think that has to do with how the chapter is organized. Yeah, a lot of books, kind of and even one that's written textbooks, we have to put it in a certain order. But we wonder sometimes about, is the order really the appropriate way? Is there, how many of you, when you put together your program, you're skipping around chapters because you found a way to deliver it that meets the knowledge of your students, that meets the ability, not use the same process, to the process of learning. Yeah, and we have students, especially nowadays, I'm sure a lot of us are in an online environment, and some of your students may not move over to that as well. Whereas opposed, maybe the opposite side, some of our other students who are more adept to watching education and information online, YouTube videos, and interactive games, they may actually benefit more from that. So these are some things that we're going to look at and to explore. So I want to understand, so why don't they all just get it? We know that we're going to go from A to B. You got to get from airway to breathing. And some of them, it's easy. They get there, it's the allotted amount of time. Then you have those students who are a little bit ahead of us. They're a little bit faster. They get that information. They get it quickly and efficiently. Those are the ones that are nice. And we're going to talk about them in terms of looking at becoming to help us in the class. Then we have those students, it just takes them, no matter how much you give them, how much what time you give them, it just takes them longer to get to A to B, from A to B. And it's going to be different for every single learner. And then, of course, we have just those ones, they are just all over the place. They get A to B. How they got there, we really don't know. It took 14 different detours, but they got there. And we have to look at it. And the thing is you're going to have all these learners in one class. We're going to have every single learner out there and their abilities and their knowledge and their capabilities in our class. Wouldn't it be nice if everyone learned at the same rate? But they don't. So I want to talk about the elephant, and I use the phrase the elephant quite a bit. And let's take, for example, advanced airway management. Now think about that time you left the tools out on the table and the desk, and the students came in the first day and they just start shoving things in all different orifices on there, and you have no idea what they're doing. They pinch their fingers, they break stuff. But when we start looking at the idea of how do we teach this information? How do we teach advanced airway and advanced ventilatory management? How do we teach advanced cardiology? Because they're going to come in and they may not have a solid understanding. Some of them may have a very firm understanding. So it's kind of leads us into the thing called the zone of proximal development. And in terms of the zone of proximal development, it's by a gentleman, a Russian psychiatrist by the name of Lev Vygotsky. And he looks at the idea that learning precedes development. And he goes in this theory of learning called the social cultural theory of learning. And that through others, we become ourselves. We learn from each other. We learn from our environment. We look at concepts, ideas, and facts, skills, and attitudes. And it shapes who we become, shapes who we are. The instruction must awaken and bring to life those functions that are in the process of maturing. And that's kind of the whole idea. He looked at children. He looked at children and how they learned. And they started to, some cognitions and education folks started to look at that and say, how can we start to incorporate that? And when we look at the idea of the zone of proximal development, we start here at what's known as the ADL. And the ADL is the actual development level. This is where each student is. Now, mind you, every student you have is going to be at a different ADL. Now, ADL sits in the zone of current development. The zone of current development is how the student, or what the student can learn on their own. They have the ability. They have the ability to problem solve. They don't need help. So we go from the zone of actual development level, then we look at the zone of, we look at the potential development level, the PDL. This is where we want the student to be. This is where the student can get. This is also different from student to student. But that's where we want them to go to. And we need to be able to get them from A to B. And getting them from A to B puts us into what's known as a zone of proximal development. This is what the student can learn with help. It's a critical concept to understand for scaffolding. And in the zone of proximal development, the student can't do it on their own. Under the zone of current development, they can do it on their own. We actually want to stay out of that area because that's where they begin to get bored. But in the zone of proximal development, that's where we start to use this concept called the more knowledgeable other. And I want you to know, I don't use the teacher or the instructor as that. I said the more knowledgeable other. That may be another faculty member. It may be a student. Have you ever taught something that you've never done before? Maybe in a refresher class and someone, or maybe you've never encountered before, but someone in the refresher class has? Use them to tell their story, to give basis for what you're teaching. And they're gonna have a much easier time understanding what you're teaching because they have something to associate it with, as opposed to those who do not. So it can be other students, a teacher, a lecturer, could all be the more knowledgeable other. And the more knowledgeable other really doesn't even need to be a person. It can be a tool. It can be a YouTube video. It can be a Vimeo video. It can be any type of information out there that allows that student to go from their level of actual development to the level of potential development. Now, the thing to understand is that the zone of proximal development is fluid. It moves, it shifts on the learning. And we want them to be able to get to the objectives. So the objectives that we write, the objectives of our program, help us develop that zone of proximal development. And as they gain the information, as they start to learn it, it's going to grow. And hopefully it's going to get us to the point where we reach the goal of the program. So another way to look at zone of proximal development is that it is a continuous process. So here we have the actual development level, and here we have what we want them to learn. And you see there's a big gap between those two. You can't just go from A to B. Even though on that slide we show going from A to B, that's nice, but there has to be a way to get there. And we have to put together the learning. If they go from A to B without us, and your objective, your goal, they can get to without us as instructors or instructional designers, then you're now teaching in the zone of current development. You're not needed. We're going to develop learning activities. We're going to develop and put together our class and our course to allow them to be able to meet that potential development level. Well, now what happens is now that PDL becomes our ADL. It's now our potential development level becomes our actual development level, and we put together a new potential development level. It's a step process going from step to step to step. And we have to look at that the entire time. And it's going to just continue on. It's an endless process. So if we look at that, we can break it down in using like a Venn diagram. There are those things the students can't do. No matter what they do, no matter what information you throw at them, they just won't be able to do it. It's beyond their zone of proximal development. When we put together these lessons, we want to put it at the potential development level, at the very edge of the ZPD. If we go beyond that, what do you think happens? If we go beyond the potential development level, if we go beyond the zone of proximal development, what do you think happens? This is where you find the chat button. If you go beyond that actual development level, if you go beyond, they're going to get frustrated. They have a hard time, become more frustrated, they become confusing. Frustration point, they quit very much. You know, they are either challenged or lost. And the thing is, once you go beyond that development level, we've no longer challenged them, we've lost them. The more angry looks, definitely more angry looks, you know, with those. So there's things that they can do, and we talked about that. If they can do it on their own, they don't need us, they're gonna get bored. And where this starts to overlap here, let me see if I can do this. I got a new toy. I got one of these pens I can write on here. I'm hoping it's going to work. Actually, I got to come down here and turn it on here. Oh, see, that's the problem with the pen. Excuse me. Pen. Let's make it a color you can see. There we go. All right, so if we look at the idea, is right in here. Can and can't do. That's the area we start to look at as we design our courses. And as we come in, there's things that they can do with tools, which are what we're talking about today, the scaffolding tools. There's things that they can't do. Even if you give them tools, they're not going to be able to do it. Our whole goal is to take what they can do, what they can't do, and using tools, they'll be able to learn. They'll be able to gain that information. And that's kind of what it says. So the question, what if some of the class is beyond their zone, and for some is right in their zone? That's an excellent question, Donna. That's every single class we have. And one of the premises of the social cultural theory of learning is that's where those people who are in their zone, they can help those. They're now, that student becomes the more knowledgeable other for the other student, and they can work together. And we develop our activities, our scaffolds, to address them, but at the same time challenging our more advanced student. And if you think about this, we'll get into this a little bit later, but if you think about giving scenarios, you know, there's certain scenarios, certain students, you can give a scenario that if you have the lights turned off in the room, it's going to shut them down. They don't know what they're going to do, you know. But then you have other students that you can throw everything at them and they'll handle it. And that's the thing, is it has to be fluid. It's never going to be the same. So when we look at the idea, when we look at you know, their zone of actual development and then their level of potential development, it's different for every single person. It'll be in different realms. And it may take more steps. There may be more steps in this area for others to get there. And that's what we have to work towards. That's what we have to look at, because no course is going to be at the same level. We're going to have people come in with all different backgrounds, all different knowledges. And that's by taking the ability to learn through interaction, the ability to learn together helps it. Through others, we become ourselves. It's a social cultural context. And this is how students begin to learn. Any of you that use peer teaching or peer evaluations, of course, if you're doing a paramedic program, you're using the peer evals with your students, but use it with your EMTs. And I've been using it with my EMT students I've been teaching this year, and watching them work together with the skill sessions and the skills and what they're working towards. And I have one military, I have an EMT student who's from the military, combat rescue saver, and watching her interact with the students and teaching them certain skills, and it helps reinforce it. So it can be very, very beneficial. So the thing is, getting from A to B can be very difficult at times. As specific tasks become automatic, working memory is available for meaning and making everything. We want the skills to become automatic, because when it becomes automatic, when they start to develop the muscle memory on those, it allows them more time to think about other connections and other ways we can look at things. You have to learn the rules before you have to understand the rules before you learn the exceptions. How many times have we used that? Because that's a key part of our teaching. Our students, well, all of us as humans, we have very limited cognitive resources. And trying to throw a whole big thing at a student, such as advanced airway and ventilatory management, to someone who's never dealt with that before, can just shut them down. We can really only work with about 5 to 7 pieces of new information and previously learned associated bits of information at a time. Scaffolds allow us to bring in new information. Scaffolds are not for information that's already learned. So how do we do this? Well, this is a big topic. There's my elephant again. Many of you know, our dear friend, may he rest in peace, Rich Beebe, taught me, one of my mentors in terms of teaching and education and everything like that. And I'll never forget, he says, how do you eat an elephant? And everyone just looked at him. He goes, one bite at a time. And that's how we have to create our educational programs, our lessons, our scaffolds. We look at our scaffold, we have to look at the idea of, here's this huge, massive topic, and how are we going to teach it? We're going to teach it one bite at a time. We're going to break it down. We're going to break it into its individual pieces. And the students, and we're going to teach in each individual piece. The students are going to learn each individual piece, and then they're going to start to bring it together. It's called chunking. And it helps you to work the working memory, as well as a long-term transfer of the information. And that's kind of the whole goal of what we're going for. So how can we get from A to B? Scaffolding. Right? It's attendee interaction time, so prepare your keyboards. Let me ask you, how would you define what a scaffold is? If someone had no idea what a scaffold is, and based on your knowledge, how would you define what a scaffold is? Yeah, here we go.
Hello, everyone. I'm coming directly.
Don't put anything there. Structured tools. Okay, good. Put that there for later. Here we go. A ladder with lots of support. Here we go. There we go. Support structure that allows levels to be completed and in this case understood. High flat surface with dangerous if built incorrectly. Love it. Oh, how many times have you been dealt with students that have come in that have had bad basics? Piece of information or a process that imports a piece of information. All excellent. So I saw some construction things, I saw some educational things. So when we look at the idea of scaffolding, it's a temporary structure. We see them on the outsides of buildings, and we start to look at the idea of the constructivist approach or concept of constructivism in terms of education, how we build from the ground up. You have to have a solid foundation to have a good solid third or fourth floor. And that's how we do it. But how do you do it? You don't just go from the basement to the ceiling, to the roof. Is you build a floor at a time. And as it gets higher, you go ahead and you take your scaffolds and you build them up higher and higher and higher. Now, it's not always going to be needed. And when we look at the characteristics of what a scaffold is, one, they're temporary. They provide support. They function only as a tool. They extend the range of the worker. So, and in this case, they extend the range of the learner. It allows them to get to that next level, over the next hump. They allow workers to accomplish a task that without it is impossible. You can't paint, you can't put bricks up on the third floor from down here on the ground. And you could use a ladder, but what would you have to do? You'd have to move the ladder all the time, every time you did that. But by putting a scaffold up, they can move smoothly through. And they are used selectively. Again, if we're only cleaning a window, we don't need to put a whole scaffold up. If we're laying brick, we may have to. And scaffolding is essentially, it's an act of teaching that supports the immediate construction of knowledge by the learner. And it provides the basis for future and independent learning of that individual. But the thing is, we have to understand, you see scaffolds up, but when the building's done, when the construction is over, when the learning has been completed, the scaffolds have to come down. They're temporary. But we don't just rip them down. We don't just take the skill sheets out of their hands and say, all right, you're done. We have to be able to find a way to gradually dismantle those and step back. And if we can allow the student to do that, to realize when they don't need these supports anymore, anymore, they start to realize that they don't need it. But what happens is if we take away that scaffold too fast, if we dismantle it too quickly, the learning and the learning doesn't have a chance to occur completely. And frustration begins to set in with the learner. Oh, so forgot my little animations there. Sorry, I got tied up in that. Another way to look at it is scaffolding our training wheels. Think about, all right, first question. You don't have to answer this in chat, but just think, how many of you have kids, or at least know of kids that you have? I have two. I've taught two successfully, fairly well in terms of riding their bike. And how do we do that? Well, some of you may be the cruel ones that said, here's your bike, go. And they end up on the ground for you. I try not to do that, but we don't do that with our students. We don't just sit there and say, here's this tool. Here's a fully functioning defibrillator. Go have fun. Hang on a minute. We don't do that. We start little by little. In terms of riding a bike, how do we do it? We may have gotten out there with the child and said, okay, here's the bike. We may start with a tricycle. So they understand the idea of pedaling. They understand the idea of steering. They understand the idea of trying to avoid the tree or the fence, which none of my students successfully were able to manage too well. But then we have the bike, we get them on the bike, we show them the coaster brakes, maybe it has hand brakes, and we have the training wheels on and we let them ride. And they do one of these things, they ride for a little while and they start to get pretty good at it. So then you take the training wheels, you don't take them away, but you change them. You bring them up. You bring them up higher. So now they start to feel the wobble, but they're still safe because it tips over, it doesn't fall over on them. They don't end up like our patient over, they don't end up like this. So we raise them up a little bit higher, and now they're still getting a little bit more steady on it, trying to get the balance down. So then it's time. We take off the training wheels, put the helmet on them, we hold the back of their seat, and we start going. And we run next to them. And eventually the best feeling of the parent is letting go of that seat and seeing them go down the road. And of course, if you're like me, like, you're going too far, come back. They go down around the block. You're like, oh, where'd they go now? They're free. But that's what we have to do as we look at the educational scaffolds, is making sure that we don't just take away those training wheels. We don't just let them go on their own without some background knowledge, without the support, because otherwise they get frustrated. So when we look at scaffolding, there are two critical elements to developing and doing scaffolding. The very first one is modeling. And this is something that is not new to any of you that teach. But through modeling, we want to be able for our students to look at us, to do what we, model and mimic what we do, which is really something we have to keep in the back of our minds, because there's a lot of, and we'll talk about expert blindness a little bit later, but there's skills that we do, we've become so remote in how we do it. It's become such built into our muscle memory. Sometimes we forget those little basic nuances, those basic steps that these students will need to learn the skill. We have to make sure we understand the skill ourselves and why each step is important. We may have kind of blown off. We may have developed poor skill sets, poor habits. Not that any of us have ever done that in the field, but some poor habits, and that we need to fix those because the students are going to do what we do. That will make them successful. So after we do modeling, there has to be practice. The students, whether individually or in a group, they have to be given the opportunity to work collaboratively. They may work with the teacher, they may work with their peers, but they have to be able to practice the task, practice the strategy. Nowhere is this more important than in the skill development of our EMS students. And of course, they're going to be at all different levels. Going back to result of proximal development, you're going to have the Einsteins, you're going to have the rocks. And hopefully working together, they'll become successful. And as the instructor, you kind of stand back, you kind of watch and let them struggle for a little bit and see if they have it. And they may figure it out. They may seek a more knowledgeable other, which could be a classmate, or they may seek you. Or they may open their book, they may open a video, they may look at something. And you watch and you see how they get this learning. And that's the way they kind of self-scaffold. So what is a scaffold? Well, as Rich said, it's eating an elephant one bite at a time. It's going to break up the information into chunks. Look at patient assessment skill sheets. You know, scene size up, primary assessment, secondary assessment. Those are chunks. And that's one of the best ways that we start to teach our students. Have this, get this solid, now move on to this. It has to be flexible and movable because every student's going to be a little bit different. There has to be the ability for the students to kind of look at their goals and the objectives and how they're going to get there based on their learning and how they receive and use information. The other thing is a scaffold, in my belief, is going to show the overall picture. It's going to show a picture of the elephant. Because if someone's never seen that elephant and just showing them a foot or a toenail or an ear or a piece of gray, they may have no idea what that is and how that integrates. So you have to show the overall process. What a scaffold is not, however, it's not giving them something and saying, go do it. Like assigning an essay about heart failure. You know, just go, here's your reading in your book, go write a report about it. Go write a paper about it. That's not really a scaffold. That's an learning activity. And the thing is, because there's no safety net, there's no parachute, there's no scaffolding, there's nothing in there. They're going to do it on their own, and then they come out with whatever they put together. So it's not really going to be a scaffold. But why do we use scaffolds? Well, it's going to provide a lot of support for the learning environment. It allows interaction between the students, student to student, because they feel free that they can ask questions. Students are going to provide feedback, and they feel that now they're developing that peer, which is really good for when we get out into the field, that they're going to have to work with that. In this role, the teacher moves away from being the center of attention and now becomes more of a facilitator, a mentor, as you would want to put it. It becomes more, moves away from pedagogy which is instructor centered, to more of an andragogical approach, which is learner focused. So it's moving away, it's moving towards that aspect of more independent learning. We don't need to think that our students are empty vessels that we need to fill with knowledge. Sometimes they are. There are some information that we have to do that to give them the base for moving into this next level. The key thing is, by giving them these scaffolds, by giving them these learning abilities, it's going to provide incentive for them to take more of an active role in their learning. Teach and learn beyond their current skill level or even their knowledge level. Let them push themselves. There are 6 key functions of scaffolding. Recruitment. In terms of recruitment, it's going to engage the learner in interesting and meaningful activity. So we need to get them in here and say, hey, this is cool. So like any instructor course that you've taken, any educational program, you have to gain their attention. Why is this important? Why do I want to learn this? How is this going to be cool? We're going to reduce we're going to have reduction. So scaffolding is going to cause some reduction. It's going to help us as instructors develop activities around more manageable components. It's going to help us chunk it. It's going to allow maintenance, which will allow all to ensure that learning is on task and on task for a solution. So if we have a skill sheet or we have our scaffold there, are they hitting the things? Are they following this? Are they being successful in this mode of learning? If they're not, we may have to stop. We may have to go back. It's going to allow some marking, and it's going to accentuate the main parts of the activity. What are the key things here that we really, really need the students to get? What's the key concept? What's the key skill? What's the key component that they have? It's usually those critical failures that we find. But those are the key activities. It's going to add control. So it reduces the frustration level of the activity by providing guidance. Allow them to follow along. Allow them to see how things are done. And finally, demonstration. Modeling behavior. Modeling what you or your instructors do. This is why it's so important to have instructors and educators that will be good role models, because how they demonstrate what they demonstrate is how they're going to function out in the field and for the test. So there's several different approaches to scaffolding. But when we look at it, it really comes down to content, task, and material scaffolding. So when we look at content scaffolding, in terms of content scaffolding, there's 3 general techniques we can use. The first one is to use familiar, interesting content. And in content scaffolding, the teacher is going to select content that's not too difficult or unfamiliar with the students learning that skill. And this allows them to focus on the skill being taught and not really being so bogged down on content. So if we find a new strategy or to students when they begin content that's familiar or highly interesting, they're going to adapt to it much easier. And over time, as they become more and more comfortable with that, we're going to introduce more information. We're going to introduce more content and start to move away from that stuff that is more familiar towards information that's more, or I should say, less familiar to our students. Sometimes we may want to use easy content. And with this technique, it involves using content that's easy for the students in order to teach a new task or strategy at hand. It allows them to focus on the strategy. Putting an oral airway in, simple airway management. And the last one we look at technique is really start with the easy steps. What's the simple way? Open the airway. How do you open the airway? Head tilt, chin lift. Let's start with that. And here, the instructor would perform and model the more difficult steps of a task. So we can take this idea of airway management, and let's say they haven't done oral tracheal intubation yet. So we have a bunch of paramedic students here. We say, okay, here's a patient, they're not breathing. Let's work through this. Okay, what's the first thing we need to do? Okay, open the airway. All right, great. So we open the airway. What are we gonna do? Oh, and you're letting the students manage this. You let the students run this. We're gonna look in the airway, see if there's anything that needs to be suctioned. Okay, there is. Tell me, go ahead and tell me the steps for suctioning and do the suctioning. And now we get to the point of, okay, you're trying to ventilate. Can't ventilate. All right, what are you gonna do? Oh, reposition the head. So they work through it. But okay, now they want to do innovation. All right, let me walk you through the innovation process. Let me walk and model this for you. So they get the idea of how this is going to all integrate. And you're going to complete the more difficult steps. And eventually what's going to happen is you'll do that same scenario, but by the end, they're now doing the innovation. They're doing the more difficult step. Now you can take it to a can't innovate, can't ventilate scenario. All right, let's talk about surgical airway. So you have it, and you continuously move that zone of that potential development level on it. And that's how we use content scaffolding. Another one is task scaffolding. And here, the teacher begins by specifying the steps in a task or instructional strategy. They may model the steps of the task. They may verbalize the thought process. So as we're teaching it, we're talking out loud. So as we're doing a patient assessment, we're talking about, okay, I'm going to open the airway. If I have an open airway, then I'll be able to ventilate. But if I do head till chin lift, it's going to pull the tongue up off the back of the head. It's going to promote a lot easier ventilation. I'll assess for an oral airway. You see where we go. And we're thinking out loud. And it allows the students to develop the same thought process as what you want because you're modeling it. And once they start to understand the steps in the task or instructional strategy, they begin to practice this independently. And the teacher, at this point in time, starts to become less involved. And when we look at the idea, when they start this task, they're right here. They need you. They can only do a little bit. There's only a little bit they can do. But as they start to become more and more familiar with their task, their responsibility becomes greater and greater to the point they're up here and they're doing the task without you or without the more knowledgeable other. They're able to do that independently because it's not always necessarily has to be you. Then there's material scaffolding. And this is really when we start to utilize written prompts or cues such as skill sheets to perform a task or strategy. It allows them to see what's going on. It allows them to see the big picture and each individual step. And again, it's chunked. When we look at the idea here, this is just an airway management, do they prepare the patient? And they have to be able to go through, PPE, manually open the airway, adjuncts, ventilate the patient, touches pulse ox, pre-oxygenate the patient. Are they able to do this? And when they have this ability here, when they've gone ahead and mastered this content, now they can go ahead and move on to the next. So they're chunking it up. Again, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And this can go for any of the skills or any of the processes that we teach. So how do we build these scaffolds? Well, some of the key features of a scaffold is we want to create it so that there's going to be an exchange of thoughts and feelings, conscious and unconscious, between the student and the instructor. And this is where we end up having facilitation occurring, maybe some empathy going on, and it's going to be the key part. Both the teacher and the student have to have ownership. There has to be joint ownership of this task and the learning that is going to be provided. They should define and redefine this task throughout. We continuously have to be aware of where we are. We're always diagnosing. We're always looking to see where are they in the zone of proximal development? Where are they between the actual development level and the potential development level? Do we need to slow down? Do we need to add some more steps in here? More scaffolds potentially? Or do we need to speed up? Is their zone of current development catching up to us? We want to have conversations between the teacher and the student about the task. It's part of the learning situation. It's not a monologue, but a discussion. We pose open-ended questions to the students, and we start to facilitate a discussion. And hopefully there's going to be more than one person involved. And eventually what's going to happen is as they start to reach the learning, as they start to reach and engage that potential development level, we start to fade away. We let them function. We let them work on their own. One thing that we want to do, and we all do this because we're all a little bit evil on the inside, is to produce productive failures. So productive failure, this is really where the student or where student-teacher interaction occurs. The student or the instructor may give a suggestion. They may demonstrate something. They may have to give an explanation. So why it didn't work or why it didn't function the way they want to. We can do this. Provoking or noticing these errors by a teacher allows both a teacher and the student to pay attention to the task and work together to achieve understanding. And maybe through prompts or cues or explaining to them or through modeling. Doing an airway management or CPR last night, and have students that after the second shock, there's no shock advised, they check for a pulse, there's no pulse, so they went right back to CPR. And the end goal at that point in time was say, all right, now we're going to be ready to transport. And I knew they weren't quite getting it. And I said, oh yeah, by the way, ALS that you called for en route just got hit by a train. They're no longer en route. Okay, so I start doing CPR again. So I let them go through another 2 minutes of CPR. I'm like, yeah, the second ALS that you requested just drove off a cliff. Okay, back to CPR. I think we were there for about 10 minutes before I finally said, yeah, do you want an ALS? Next one's not an hour and a half away. I worked in Maine, so it's not too far removed from it. But it was only then they realized, oh, we're stuck on scene here. Yeah, you are. You need to get them off. You need to get them moving. And we talked about that. We talked about what happens in those situations, on that. So, but the thing is, our errors have to be balanced. If we don't have enough errors, a task will be too easy. Scaffold's not needed. And they're not working within their zone of proximal development. They're working in their zone of current development. So we have to have some errors in there. But yet we don't want to have so many errors that the learning process becomes counterproductive. They start focusing on these things, because it ends up becoming a situation where they lose the focus and they're just trying to solve all these different problems. And we see this a lot in simulation-based learning, where people put together these scenarios that are just absolutely crazy and they're just going to fail. Throughout the whole process, we have to make sure that we're checking for understanding, checking to make sure that the students have gained the information continuously. We want to know what they know. We want to know what they don't know throughout. Are they right? Are they wrong? And is there any source of misunderstanding? And this is an important part, is by questioning and talking with them, we're going to hopefully find that they are, or hopefully we'll find any misunderstandings that they may have. And that misunderstanding may have been from predisposed education or association. It may come from that thing that we talked about called expert blind spot. And this is one big thing that happens, especially with novice teachers, is they're so used to doing something that and the tasks have become so easy for them that they completely look over it. They don't think about it when they give that presentation. So we want to make sure that we have the ability to identify misconceptions. So just think about right now, think about your topic. What are some misconceptions that may occur on those, and how do you find them and fix them? And I'm not going to do the Jeopardy thing because we're coming up on the time. But it helps us develop our scaffolds. We want our scaffolds have the ability to interact with our students. We want to ask them, what exactly are you doing? Can you describe it precisely? Tell me what you're doing and why you're doing it. How does that fit the solution? How does it fit what we're doing? We're developing the critical thinking aspect. How does it help you? How does it help the patient in the situation? When we look at that, that's going to help us to develop our our scaffolds and put them together. So real quick, in your head, in your brain, what would be an example of a scaffold you could use for your topic? And how could we use one of those to help our learners? Some of you may do this, and if there is a mind map, oh yeah, that's Connie can tell that you and Rich and all those, Rich loved the mind maps on those. It's a great one. I started getting into those myself, how each one, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. Job performance requirements, okay, JPRs. Oh, Ball, you must be a fire. And I worked at Maryland Fire Rescue Institute. JPRs on those. But yeah, most definitely, the job performance requirements, what is expected of them. So when we look at the idea of scaffolding and the various methods of them, there's the most common thing here is see one, do one, teach one. We've all done this. Is a staple in anything that we teach. The instructor does it first. They model how to perform a new or difficult task. The class does it second. So the instructor and students work together to perform the task. The group does it. So students work in a partner or in a small group, and then the individual does it independently. And this is comes down to a lot of how we teach and test some of the skills. And we start to look at this. Some of the strategies we can look at are something called, show and tell. We all love show and tell. We love to talk about stuff. We love to do that, but we're also, a lot of us just show me. How many times that someone tries to explain something to you and you're like, just show it to me. I just want to see it. You want to see the elephant. You don't want to see the trunk. You don't want to see the foot. You don't want to see the trunk. You want to see that. Paul, thank you for coming. I know it's 1300. Oh, not a problem. But one way of doing that is through something we call the fishbowl activity. So in terms of the fishbowl activity, that's basically what we do is we put everyone kind of in the middle, a small group, they do the skill, and then we have the student around them and they're watch, and we come to a critique. We may do that with scenarios. Think alouds. And this is the thought process modeling that we talked about earlier, where you may talk out loud or you have your students talk out loud on this. Here's a big one, tapping into prior knowledge. And this is really holds to Lev Vygotsky's social cultural theory of learning, is that student may be the more knowledgeable other. Allow them to use their own experiences, their hunches, maybe even their ideas to help develop the concept, help them apply it to their background and their knowledge. And it's also a great way to introduce new topic. Hey, has anyone ever had a patient fall down a flight of stairs, or has everyone had someone choking? Give them something to kind of get that. And that goes back to the idea of gaining their attention. And the way I kind of look at this is relating the concept of a woolly mammoth to a kid and to a young kid who's never seen a dinosaur. How do you describe what a mammoth is? Well, have you seen Sesame Street, Mr. Snuffleupagus? How about Star Wars? I can't remember. You got the sand people and the big woolly mammoth things there. Or just, maybe looking at them and say, you know what an elephant looks like? And they say, oh, yeah, I know what an elephant looks like. Imagine an elephant with a lot of really long hair. And that may help them do that. And we can take that to tap into their prior knowledge and find out that knowledge, be able to associate that. We may want to give them time to talk. Sesame Street, Sesame Street. Give them time to talk. And there's something called think, pair, share, where you go ahead and you give information. Everyone stops what they're doing. They think about it. Then they pair up with a partner or a couple people and they talk about it. They share their experience. They share their beliefs in that. And that's going to help them start to become engaged. Again, it moves you away from being the focus and allows them to do. There's also turn and talk. Turn and talk is very similar to think, pair, share, but there's just no thinking. So it's basically like, here's a topic, turn and talk about it. And that's a really good way to see what people's knowledge are and how what they know and how they feel about it right now without thinking what's important. Vocabulary, med terminology can be very difficult. Med math could probably maybe even fall into this. Pre-teach some of this information. We don't use this enough. Pictures, context, analogies, metaphors are all ways that we can use scaffolding strategies, especially with medical terminology. A lot of times I'll be talking to students about, all right, your patient has, appears to, have a level of dyspnea or trouble breathing that you're not aware of, or difficulty breathing, and, your hands are tingling, paresthesia. So I'll take the medical term and use the generic term to define it. So they start to hear me using those interchangeably. And as we go in throughout the class, I'll start to move away from just the standard English definition and get more into the medical term. Here you go, Connie. Visual aids, mind maps. This is an event map. You can look at the idea here, an event. So we could go into a situation here. Let's go ETI issue, endotracheal intubation, stomach. It went into the stomach. So, when did it happen? It happened, at the, unfortunately, maybe we'll give a bad outcome. Is that the emergency department? Why is this important? Training, lawyers and money. How did it happen? Failure to use Untitled CO2. Who was involved? And where did it happen? And maybe it was the move. So using an event map can help us and help students kind of work through things. So you could do that. The mind map, like what Connie brought up, is say, okay, heart failure. Let's talk about all the different, let's talk about cardiac. Let's talk about pulmonary. Let's talk about renal systems and break off from there. It's a great tool to use with our students. Pause, ask, pause, review. Similar. So we're going to say something, pause. We're going to go now ask a strategic question. We designed ahead of time, and that they are very specific, they're very guided, and they're generally open-ended. We'll pause, and then we're going to engage the class to talk about it. Media as necessary. We are a media-rich group. There's a lot of, I think, especially in terms of online presentations and online learning, no reason why not to use some of the media out there. Maybe even having students go out and find it on their own, come back and present what they found, because we all know there's some stuff out there that's pretty bad, but that may be a great learning activity to say, okay, here's why it's bad. Here's why that's not effective. One of my favorite, cooperative-based learning. This really is the epitome of social-based learning, social cultural theory of learning, in that we learn from each other. It's not group work. Putting students together and assigning them a task will not always lead to learning. We've been there. We have to walk around and make sure that they're staying on that. But what we do is in cooperative-based learning techniques, they're intentional learning activities. The learners are going to work together to achieve the common goals, the common objectives of that activity, of that learning, of that task. And each member of that group is going to start to recognize the strengths and weaknesses that they have. And because they're all going to have different knowledge, different skill set, different experiences. And when the learner is in a state of disequilibrium, just prior to the zone of proximal development, cooperative-based learning is going to allow them to gain that equilibrium, standardize themselves to get through to the next level. And that's using that more knowledgeable other. These are great things to use. I usually like to find in cooperative-based learning, they say 6 to 10 may be acceptable, 2 to 4 are common. I think 2, 3, that's just not enough. And the programs I put together when I do cooperative-based learning, I find 4 to 8 works decent. 6 is my ideal number. I think we get a good amount of discussion. You don't get the person kind of sitting in the back not talking, even though they are probably listening, but we want to engage everybody. We have to be able to manage this and facilitate it. We ask open-ended questions. We want to keep the current thought on process, make sure everything comes in, and eavesdropping, seeing where where they are. And there's a lot of different ways. Jigsaw is one of my favorite. And the jigsaw activity, what you're going to do is you have A, B, and C. So you send and you have groups. So one person from each group goes to A, one goes to B, one goes to C. They learn about that. They come back and they teach each other. They teach each other. It's one of my favorite is using Jigsaw. It's absolutely a great way of teaching. Real quick, not a lot of time. We're wrapping up. Any other forms of scaffolding that we didn't hit? Throw them into the chat. Throw them out to us, and we can have that for that so others can see it, but I am going to continue on because we are coming up a little bit close on that. So when we start looking at strategies for it, we want to make sure that there's a lot of guidelines in terms of developing our scaffolding strategies. You know, select the suitable tasks that match the curriculum goals and learning objectives students' needs. You know, allow the students to create their own instructional goals. And this is going to help allow the students become more motivated and their commitment to the learning process. We want to consider students' backgrounds and prior knowledge to assess their progress, to make sure that we're not in that zone of current development at all, and that we're not beyond the zone of proximal development, that we're hitting in that middle in there. And use a variety of supports throughout the task: prompts, questions, hints, stories, models, visual scaffolding. All these are going to help us point to where the learning is, where it's going, and if there's any issues. We need to always provide encouragement and praise. We don't want to belittle them. The minute we do that, we're going to shut them down. That's something that we have to be very careful for in our business, because we tend to eat our children at times. We always want to monitor student progress through feedback. And it could be quizzes, could be questioning, through discussion, just watching them. Because it's going to give us an idea where they are in that zone of proximal development and if additional steps are needed. Safe working environment. They have to know, students have to feel comfortable to be able to fail. I coach hockey, I coach goalies. I tell all my goalies, you either win or you learn. You never lose. Through failing, we learn, especially in the classroom environment. Students have to feel comfortable to be able to do that. And finally, you know, the scaffold has to really make sure that the student becomes less dependent upon the instructional supports, and less scaffolding. We become independent learners. And really the whole thing is the benefits of the benefits of scaffolding is it does challenge the learners through deep learning and discovery, engages them on all aspects, meaningful and dynamic discussions in small group classes. We as instructors become more the facilitators of that. And it's going to really afford a much better learning environment for our students. There are some challenges. Planning and implementing is a lot harder than standing and delivering a lecture. We have to find the right method, right types of scaffold that's going to reach each student in each way that they learn and that they receive information. We're going to have to know when to remove it. Again, removing it too fast could be detrimental. Leaving it in, they're going to get bored. And that's going to have just as much of an impact in their learning. And not knowing the students well enough to provide appropriate scaffolds. If it's a first group, you've never had them, you never know what you're going to get into. So you may have to make adaptations. And really, folks, the thing is, ultimately, our goal with using scaffold is delivering information that leaves their training wheels behind. Folks, I want to thank you very much for attending us here, you know, online with NAMSI. I want to thank everyone's help, and Nate especially for his help on there. If there's any questions, throw them in there. I have time, so please feel free to enter. I can put any questions on there. But again, thank you for interacting and thank you for being with us. Stay safe out there, folks. Wear your masks and be very careful.